Hello, how you guys doing? I hope you doing well. I hope just staying warm. Um, just hanging in there myself. Well, there's something I want to show you that's really very interesting. Um, this don't talk about riots across America in the past, and it's going to be racial riots and where it started at, and then during the different centuries, showing you how the past you see comes towards the present. And you're gonna hear. I'm gonna play a couple of short videos, not too long, on each video, because just for a different cut edit for a couple of reasons. But I'm gonna show you enough to show you that there was some history with this stuff. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe. I'll get back with my commentary.
We're constantly bombarded with movies that don't really tell the whole story in its proper context, often inserting other narratives or values. Today, I thought I'd illuminate our ancestors who stood up against tyranny and oppression. The ancestors who said, "We've had enough." Here and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and supporting this content. If you'd like access to full courses and sources, or you simply want to show your support, you may do so by clicking the Patreon link in the description box below. To begin, it's important to note that the slave rebellions I'll be talking about today are just the more popular ones. There were countless others that will not be mentioned in this video for the sake of time, and because many of the other ones were just poorly recorded for obvious reasons. So, let's begin. Contrary to popular belief, our ancestors never just laid down and accepted enslavement. Throughout the long history of slavery, people of African descent fought against it every step of the way. The ways in which they fought and resisted was diverse. Some ran to the mountains and founded sovereign regions. Some took up arms or any weapon they could find or make. And some even decided to take their own life, like in the case of Igbo Landing, where a group of captive Igbo people chose to drown themselves in a creek rather than to submit to slavery. Now, as unsettling as that may sound, they represented a core value in the consciousness of many Afro-descendant people, and their form of resistance was immortalized in African American folklore. If you watch films about slavery in popular culture, you might get the impression that slavery was pretty straightforward, and slaveholders were in total comfort as their enslaved Africans worked the fields. However, the historical record proves otherwise. Letters and diaries from the American South in the 1800s indicate that slaveholders lived in constant fear of rebellion, and the Haitian Revolution pretty much gave them a heart attack. To repress and control slave rebellion, especially in those places such as South Carolina and the Caribbean islands, where persons in slavery outnumbered the free sometimes 10 to 1, Africans were forbidden to meet in groups or to learn to read, and they lived under the constant scrutiny of their overseers. Families were often separated, further increasing their isolation from one another and from white society. Despite all these precautions, however, slave rebellions were just inevitable. In 1800, an African named Gabriel Prosser led the first large-scale revolt of enslaved Africans in the United States. His plan was to create an independent black state in Virginia, with himself as its head. His plan was to march on Richmond, Virginia at the head of an army of 1,000 followers failed because heavy rains washed out the bridges and flooded the roads that led to the arsenal and powder house. The state militia captured Prosser and 34 of his followers before they could regroup their forces, and all were hanged. In 1811, nearly 500 Africans on a plantation near New Orleans, Louisiana, took up weapons with the intent of marching on New Orleans and freeing all the Africans there. They killed an unrecorded number of people and burned a number of plantations along the way until they were stopped by government troops 10 miles from the city. In 1821, a freedman named Denmark Vesey began to organize the most extensive slave revolt ever planned in the United States, which was to take place among the enslaved Africans on the plantations in Charleston, South Carolina. By 1822, he and his fellow leaders had gained widespread support in the region. However, the rebels were betrayed from within by a traitor who knew all their plans, and Vesey and his lieutenants were also hanged. I have no doubt that if Denmark Vesey was successful and had not been betrayed by his own, at the very least, American society for a moment would have come to a complete stop, and at its best, his success would have changed the course of world history. Just imagine a formerly enslaved man defeating an American militia and creating an independent state in the American South, a black nation in the heart of America. That would have been something. In 1831, Nat Turner led 75 followers in what was to become the only rebellion by Africans in the United States history that did not quickly die out. It took place near Jerusalem, Virginia. 60 whites were killed, including Turner's master and his family. Hundreds of whites fled, and many left the state for good. Turner was captured and hanged, but slaveholders became keenly aware of the anger and resentment Africans had in bondage. Unrest among Africans was not restricted to the southern states, however. An insurrection in New York City in 1712 led to the murder of 9 whites and the execution of 17 enslaved Africans. In 1741, again in New York City, where one of the 5 inhabitants was in African bondage, a number of conspiracy trials were held as a result of a series of incidents of arson and burglary that led many to believe that an African revolt was imminent. The supposed revolt's leader, called Caesar, and 5 other Africans were hanged. Some historians have compared these trials to the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692. Now, as you can see, all of the rebellions took place pretty close in date to one another. Hence, the reason why so many slaveholders were always paranoid. Given the history of all these rebellions, and these are just the more popular ones, we quickly realized that slavery was just not sustainable. It would have eventually come to a screeching halt, probably through violence. And all it takes is just one victory to change the course of history. And it was the Haitians who taught us this. Undoubtedly, the greatest and most glorious slave rebellion in human history was the Haitian Revolution that began in 1791. Sometimes we forget that throughout human history, slaves have existed in all corners of the planet from various groups of people. To really understand the greatness of the Haitian Revolution, it must be put in the context of other slave rebellions across the globe. The Haitian Revolution is so special because it was the only successful slave rebellion that led to the formation of a state. No other people on the planet had accomplished this. In other words, Spartacus and his men couldn't accomplish what the Haitians could. Africans in Haiti grossly outnumbered the white slaveholders. An estimated 500,000 Africans worked on the sugar, coffee, indigo, and other plantations in the colony. The slave system in Haiti had the reputation of being the cruelest in the Western Hemisphere. Africans who refused to submit in other colonies were threatened with being sent there. The grotesque white supremacist determination to rob Africans of their humanity led French plantation owners in Haiti to work their enslaved Africans to death, preferring to replace them rather than to improve their living and working conditions as they had done more often in Brazil and in many parts of the Caribbean and North America. Dutty Boukman began the revolution in 1791. Leadership of the revolt in Haiti was soon assumed by the charismatic Toussaint Louverture, and the first leader of an independent black nation in the Americas was Jean Dessalines. Under Dessalines, Haiti became the first country in the Americas to permanently abolish slavery. Initially a governor-general, Dessalines was later named Emperor of Haiti by the generals of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitians fought and defeated the French and won their independence. This was no doubt one of the most impressive feats in human history because it had never been done before. Most slave rebellions in other parts of the Caribbean were short-lived, even if they found success. The more prominent ones occurred in Brazil, in St. Kitts and Nevis, Jamaica, Suriname, Montserrat, Belize, and Guyana. What's even more impressive, in my opinion, is the often neglected portion of rebellions on slave ships. Many Africans didn't even wait to be exported to their destination. They rebelled on the ship itself, which, in all honesty, may be the best place to start. Two famous revolts occurred at sea after the 19th century began. The revolt aboard the Amistad on a voyage from West Africa to Cuba in 1831, and the revolt on board the American brig Creole on a voyage from Richmond and Hampton Roads in Virginia to New Orleans in 1841. Those held responsible for the revolt aboard the Amistad were defended in court by former President John Quincy Adams. In a judgment that surprised many people of the time, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the 53 Africans aboard the Amistad who overwhelmed the crew and brought their vessel into American waters for protection were justified in their actions. With the help of missionary and abolitionist groups, the mutineers returned home to Sierra Leone in 1842. However, the Africans aboard the Creole weren't so fortunate, as their revolt was put down and they were returned to slaveholders. So what's the point of all this? Well, I think it's important to know this history because popular culture is not going to edify you. They're going to tell the story that suits their needs and concerns. And so we miss out on just how common slave rebellion was and how our ancestors resisted every step of the way. We cannot forget that it was our ancestors who truly advanced the flames of freedom and liberty, holding the entire world accountable. Well, I'm all out, God.
If you've been waiting for another round of stimulus checks, then listen up. Y'all are entitled to $5,400 in your pocket due to
years of resentment at the accumulation of wealth and power by the haughty prerogative faction led by Hutchinson. Behind every swing of the axe and every hurled stone, behind every shattered crystal goblet and splintered mahogany chair, lay the fury of a plain Bostonian who had read or heard the repeated references to impoverished people as rabble and to Boston's popular caucus led by Samuel Adams as a herd of fools, tools, and sycophants. It seems to Nash that violence is kind of like a release valve for pent-up rage, part and parcel with protesting and demonstrations. While wine and silverware might seem like, well, theft, Nash would argue that these things were symbols of power, wealth, and oppression. And so the mob violence was actually attacking these symbols or redistributing the wealth and the resources. Like I said earlier, keep a pin in this idea of attacking symbols of power and oppression. While the Stamp Act riots really illustrate this point, they aren't the only examples of this sort of riot in the colonial and revolutionary eras. In fact, in the Carolinas, there was such unrest between 1765 and 1771 that it was called the War of Regulation. It started as protests, threats, harassment of government officials, and it escalated to actually breaking up a court, dragging judges through the streets in 1768. During this demonstration, the courthouse was ransacked in a symbolic manner, including someone taking a shit on the judge's seat, as well as looting some private businesses that didn't have anything to do with the oppression. They burned a judge's house to the ground and beat one lawyer, Edmund Fanning, to the point of almost putting out his eye. Just like with the Stamp Act riots, no uprising was complete without ransacking his house and drinking all his booze. Power to the people. By 1771, an anti-government regulator militia actually fought a pro-government state militia. While the regulators were eventually defeated, this arguably galvanized support in the Carolinas for the coming American Revolution, depending on which historians you believe. We see again that a lot of this violence was targeted and symbolic. You have judges and lawyers and courthouses being attacked, but there was also general looting and destruction of property, which didn't always have to do with tax collection and the corrupt powers that the regulators were fighting against. You can even see parallels to today in the Boston Massacre. It starts off with insults being hurled and eventually rocks and snowballs and ice balls, and eventually it turns into state violence being used against the crowd. And if anyone doesn't believe me that there's parallels to that today, I'm putting a link in the description that shows a lot of video of peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters being attacked by the state and then responding with an escalation. During the Revolutionary War itself, it wasn't just military fighting, but also protesting and mob action, especially in the central and southern colonies. On January 1st, 1776, Loyalists and Patriots had been at odds for a while, and the British sent their Navy and landing party to support the Loyalists. The Navy caused some fires by bombardment to places held by Patriots, but the Patriot forces drove off the landing parties and most of the Loyalists. They celebrated their victory by putting out the fires and returning order. No, I'm just kidding. They looted and wrecked loyalist shops, including a distillery. Power to the people. The Southern theater of the American Revolutionary War was marked by patriot and loyalist militias and irregular troops absolutely brutalizing and terrorizing each other, including civilians and property. Rather than just being a clean military affair, we can see events like Norfolk playing out all over the American Revolution. It wasn't just a military conflict, it was a conflict of mob and political violence. You have people smashing windows, tarring and feathering each other, dragging each other out of houses, including one man who had his legs tarred, but then instead of being feathered, they actually lit him on fire, and he did lose a couple toes over it. This partisan violence between loyalists and patriots led to tens of thousands of former loyalists fleeing to different British colonies. For more about how the American Revolution was really categorized by mob violence and not just military violence, I highly recommend you check out Alan Taylor's American Revolutions, especially Chapter 7. He does a great job taking a look at the dirtier side, the more mob-focused side of the conflict, and doesn't just focus on the clean military battles. I've seen a lot of debate online about the Boston Tea Party and whether this counts as a riot. People are arguing about, was this targeted violence? Was it just attacking the tea as a symbol of oppression and the act against which they were rebelling? Or was it the sort of political violence we see in the Black Lives Matter protests today? But you'll notice I didn't address this on purpose because looking at events like Norfolk, looking at the Stamp Act riots, the War of Regulation, things like that, we can see that there was looting, there was mob violence, even if we don't even look at the Boston Tea Party. We still see political violence with targeting symbols of oppression, but we also see looting, rioting, property destruction, and of course, raiding booze. Oh god, I'm gonna be sick. Part 3, Political Violence in American Tradition. As you can see in colonial and revolutionary era America, demonstrations often move between what is a protest and what is a riot. We do see clear symbols of oppression targeted, but we also see general looting, assault, battery, destruction, theft, and even drinking. An idea that I want to put out, though, is that all this debating and hand-wringing over what is and isn't a riot might be missing the point. The demonstrations we see today were caused by something. There is a real movement behind it, and so far it actually seems to be having an effect. At the time of writing and filming this, all 4 officers involved in the death of George Floyd are being charged. Before the demonstrations and riots, the police were only fired, and then only 1 was charged, and then all 4. The protests and riots kept escalating, and so too did the justice against the 4 officers. On June 4th, the case of Breonna Taylor's murder was actually reopened, and we're starting to see testimonies come out about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Say what you will about the tone of the demonstrations, but they are starting to have an effect. In addition, I think we should think critically and critically analyze what we see when it comes to political violence in the demonstrations today. Have some small or minority-owned businesses been targeted or destroyed? Undoubtedly, it has happened. We have evidence of it. But think about what a lot of the destruction or looting represents as far as symbols go. You see banks getting destroyed, and that kind of makes sense since banks use things like redlining or predatory loans to victimize poor communities and people of color for decades. You see big box stores getting raided and destroyed like Target or AutoZone, and that makes sense because they represent capitalism and the exploitation of workers, which does hurt poor communities disproportionately. A socialist view of this event would be that these are workers taking the value of their labor back and reappropriating it. Back to the American Revolution, Barbara Clark Smith found over 30 instances between 1776 and 1779 of food riots and food redistribution. They viewed a lot of the merchants as price gouging or not giving the food to communities that needed it, so they went in and raided and took the food and redistributed it themselves. A study of the riots in 1968 found that the most common targets for riots or looting were big box stores, government buildings, and other representations of oppression. These were much more likely to be targeted when they're viewed as symbols rather than random buildings or apartment complexes. To quote an article from The Atlantic discussing this sort of thing, "In this way, some of the looting is a lashing out against capitalism, the police, and other forces that are seen as perpetuating racism. Widespread looting, then, may perhaps be interpreted as a kind of mass protest against our dominant conceptions of property." Dines and Corentelli wrote, "It is a bid for the redistribution of property.
Andrew S. Boyles interviewed one looter who viewed it as retribution for the exploitation of communities of color. To this looter, the store that was built on exploitation did nothing to alleviate the suffering of communities of color, was it?
Wait, stop. Don't skip this video because I've got great news for you and your hair. If you are tired of losing...
1921, a white mob with incendiary rage burned Greenwood to ash. Even memories were murdered when the dead were dropped into unmarked graves. Last December, before the pandemic, we found Tulsa preparing to embrace a reckoning with a plan to exhume the truth and raise the dead. The story will continue in a moment.
The community that is Greenwood has thriving businesses, professional offices, doctors, lawyers, dentists. The history of
John W. Franklin speaks of Greenwood in the present tense.
Greenwood is the nexus of that African American community.
Perhaps because he studied Greenwood in 32 years as a historian at the Smithsonian, or likely because Greenwood is personal.
And my grandfather moves here from Rentersville in February 1921. And he's the first person in the family to go to college, Buck Colbert Franklin.
Buck Colbert Franklin was a lawyer who chased his dream to a promised land. Booker T. Washington named Greenwood Negro Wall Street because the district was lined with black-owned shops, restaurants, 2 newspapers, a 54-room grand hotel, a hospital, and the Dreamland Theater, which would soon boast air conditioning. But on the day after Memorial Day, 1921, Buck Franklin awoke to fearful news.
He hears that there's to be possibly a lynching. There's this black man who's been caught with this white woman in the elevator, and the newspapers are saying, read all about it. There's extra, read all about it.
Tulsa's white newspapers told of a black teenager who allegedly attacked a white female elevator operator. At the jail, a lynch mob demanded the prisoner. Black veterans of World War I arrived to shield the defendant for his day in court. A shot was fired, and in a running gun battle, the mob chased the black vets to Greenwood.
One of the moments during the riot that your grandfather wrote about was this. On they rushed, whooping to the tops of their voices, firing their guns every step they took. What is it like for you to read those words today?
He too was traumatized by seeing people being shot in front of his eyes. He describes a woman who's trying to find her child who's run in front of her, and she's unafraid of the bullets raining down because her concern is to find her child.
What began as an attempted lynching at the jail erupted into a massacre. From a high-grain elevator, a machine gun laid fire on Greenwood Avenue.
Where's the fire department? Where's the police when we need them? We're part of a city. This is not some small town. This is a city of wealth and order and governance. It is now taken over by a mob.
The police joined the mob. National Guard troops pressed the attack against what one guard officer called the enemy. Quotes from eyewitnesses include, "Old women and men, children, were running and screaming everywhere." A deputy sheriff reported a black man dragged behind a car. His head was being bashed in, the deputy said, bouncing on the steel rails and bricks. But what happened next may have frightened Buck Franklin even more.
And he hears planes circling and sees roofs of buildings catching fire. And these are from turpentine balls, burning turpentine balls dropped from planes.
The first time in American history, the airplanes we used to terrorize America was not at 9/11, was not at Pearl Harbor. It was right here in the Greenwood district.
Reverend Robert Turner's Vernon AME Church was among at least 5 churches burned. along with 1,200 homes. A photo was crudely and imperfectly hand-lettered at the time, running the Negro out of Tulsa.
36 square blocks, city blocks, was destroyed. And before they destroyed it, they looted. They took nice furniture, money.
When the Black Hospital burned, white hospitals refused to take Greenwood's wounded. Those who bled to death included Greenwood's most prominent surgeon. Ultimately, one hospital did make space in its basement for black casualties. The number of dead is estimated between 150 and 300. Survivors included 10,000 now homeless African Americans. 6,000 of them were herded into internment camps and then released weeks later.
I don't know how they did it, but the following Sunday after the massacre, they came and worshiped in our basement. And that's the same basement that we have today.
The death of a black man at the hands of police is today shouted into the national memory.
Thanks to all of you for being here.
But in 1921, it remained possible to erase a genocide.
I grew up attending segregated Tulsa public schools. Never in any of the schools was anything ever said about it.
The congregation of Vernon AME Church is 2 generations beyond 1921, but they too were victimized.
This was not taught in the public school.
No.
You never heard about this in class.
Never heard a word about it.
When I went to OU in 1998, I was sitting in a class of African American history, and the professor was talking about this place where black people had businesses and had money and had doctors and lawyers, and he said it was in Tulsa, and I raised my hand and said, no, I'm from Tulsa. That's not accurate. And he was talking about this massacre, riot. I said, man, what are you talking about? I said, I went to school on Greenwood. I've never heard of this ever.
How many people were arrested, tried for what happened in Greenwood?
No one.
200 or 300 people murdered, an entire community burned to the ground, and the police were unable to find a single person.
It's a real tragedy.
I picked the software engineering program because they pay very well. It's a fast-paced industry. The boot camp allowed.
After the American Civil War, the country entered a period known as Reconstruction, during which it set about reintegrating the Confederate States and nearly 4 million newly freed enslaved people. But African Americans were hardly given a foundation on which to build their new lives after the war. No reparations were paid to the formerly enslaved for what they and their families had endured for generations. Many had been told they'd be given a small plot of land to get started on, and while there were plans to allocate some land to the formerly enslaved after the war, such as Special Field Order Number 15, much of the land seized by Union forces or promised to African Americans was later given back to white Southern citizens, ex-slave owners, and to white Northern entrepreneurs. The following decade saw African Americans slowly gain more economic and political power. They bought land, started businesses, and built schools. But in many places where African Americans succeeded, white Americans set out to destroy that success.
The Civil War was a revolution. It destroyed the most powerful slave-owning class in the world, and now the question is, what's going to replace it? The freed people had a clear understanding of what their freedom meant. They wanted self-determination. They wanted to reconstitute their families. They wanted to live as far away from white people as they could. They basically wanted to be left alone. But they also wanted to be citizens. And they wanted to exercise the rights that other citizens did. And so, on some level, Reconstruction was designed to answer this question about the meaning of freedom. And so African Americans became citizens. Slavery is abolished with the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment nationalizes citizenship and creates due process, and so now black people have equal protection before the law, and they can now run for office, hold office, and participate in society. It succeeded for a brief time that it existed. Black people were running for election, they were holding office, there were integrated schools. We were beginning to act and behave like a democracy. By 1877, as the North tires of Reconstruction, we see the withdrawal of troops and on some level, really the withdrawal of federal protection of black people's rights. Just because the federal government said Reconstruction was over didn't mean that black people stopped living their lives like free people. They continued to hold office. They continued to form these very important biracial political parties and movements. They joined interracial unions. They began to own businesses, in some cases owning land. Extraordinary success in the face of a lot of violence and not much federal protection. But what happens in the 1890s is that the Southern elite decides for themselves what the meaning of freedom is going to be. They're going to strip black people of their citizenship. White supremacy is reconstituted in the 1890s, and it can't look the same as it did in slavery. And so what you end up with is disfranchisement and segregation and sharecropping and convict labor and debt peonage, but underwriting that is extraordinary violence and terror.
I like this phrase that sociologists and historians often use to describe the country in terms of race relations, and that is that this was a period they described as the nadir of race relations in America, the low point of race relations in America. And they use that language because there was this proliferation of these events that were called race riots. They were mainly assaults on black communities. It was in New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Memphis and Omaha and Chicago and D.C. Summer and fall of 1919 was dubbed by James Weldon Johnson, who was with the NAACP, as Red Summer. Red is a metaphorical reference to blood that flowed through the streets from all this violence post-World War I. The other thing that's happening during this period is lynching. Lynching is simply a form of domestic terrorism aimed more often than not at black folks. The real aim is to strike fear in the hearts and minds of a group, black folks in this case, to make sure that black folks knew and stayed in their place. And so lynching was running rampant during this period.
The Elaine that we see today is very different from the Elaine at the time of the massacre. At the time of the massacre, it was one of the fastest growing cities and local economies in the state. The bulk of this new revenue that was coming in was from cotton sales. Cotton's at the heart of understanding what happened during the Elaine massacre. First of all, there are sharecroppers. The official name for it is debt peonage. On its surface, it seems very, very fair. Planters offer plots of their land to sharecroppers in exchange for their labor. The way the system is supposed to work is at the end of the growing season, the profits from the harvest are supposed to be split 50-50. Half going to the planter, the other half going to the laborer. However, this isn't what normally happens. There's an inherent problem when you have a planter that has to go a whole growing season and he has no income. You have to ask yourself, how does he survive? And he survives by borrowing from the planter. And this is where the plantation store comes into play. Every plantation had a plantation store. Its sharecroppers could go to that store and get items on credit. What most people don't know is that the credit offered at this store was at astronomical rates. Even when the sharecropper received his half of the shares, quite often because of these doctored books and these inflated prices, he was never able to get out of debt. And therefore, he really could not leave because he owed money. What sharecropping or debt peonage did was enable planters to have a workforce that they virtually paid nothing for. The planters would sell the cotton and quite often come back and say, well, this is all I got for it, and pay the sharecropper only a fraction of the half that he was supposed to get. This kept them in perpetual debt, and with the judicial system that was not going to allow them to leave the debt hanging, the sharecroppers were in essence made slaves. African Americans had just gone off to war. So many African Americans who had participated in the war were given promises that if they went and fought this war, they return as full-fledged citizens. So when they returned, return to these cotton fields and they find themselves being cheated just as they had before, they believe that they have recourse. And the recourse that they believe they have now is the courts. They band together, form a union, hire an attorney, and this will be their undoing once the planters find out.
You grew this kingdom. Making a text-only design used to take hours of hard work trying to figure out how to get the right adjustment. With our simple one-click
the Journal and the Constitution at the time, saying that black men were actually sexually assaulting white women when there was no record of it. But that was enough to get a mob ensued, and it started not too far from where we are. And then from that point, we have 3 days of violence.
History scholar King Williams thinks the government should post markers downtown where the violence raged in 1906.
The crowd grew bigger and bigger as they walked up.
Officially taking 26 lives, but Williams says was likely more than 100. Hoke Smith won the governor's race. The violence provoked by the newspapers receded into history.
I would guess maybe 90% of the people in the city and the state don't know about this. I wish more people knew about it.
The 1906 violence reshaped Atlanta. Black communities moved from here to points south and west of here. And the business community, it relocated to Auburn Avenue.
Reflecting on the events like those in Tulsa and here in Atlanta, bringing the reparations argument to the forefront. For decades, victims and descendants of the Tulsa massacre have called for reparations. With Democrats in power now in Washington, D.C., the issue is being seriously debated and studied.
Victims of this atrocity have been denied justice for far too long.
This ability to transfer resources across generations makes a huge difference in whether one is able to acquire wealth or not.
Wealth is built over the generations, so the destruction of homes and businesses added to the wealth gap and stopped descendants of victims from potentially building on the wealth of their ancestors. Forsyth County is often brought up in these reparations talks. Black families were violently forced out in 1912, losing their land and, for some, their lives. Though it was a mostly white agrarian community, hundreds of black families were thriving in the area at the time until they were driven out of Forsyth County.
They were forced to leave. Their property was burned, homes burned, everything that they weren't able to gather on a wagon and save was lost.
Descendants Elon Osby said that she is thankful for what the county has done so far, but wants more discussion about what families here lost not so long ago.
When my son Brian died.
Every planet except one, which is the pyramid planet. There is a planet that's a pyramid, the Shiva.
Angry mob burst through barricades and police while Congress was in session. One person has died and multiple injuries have been reported.
A curfew now in effect in Washington, D.C. until 6 a.m. And right now, Congress has resumed counting electoral college votes after being escorted in by armed guards. Good evening, I'm Christine Johnson.
I'm Maurice Dubois. Right now, people are still on the streets of D.C. despite the curfew. Trump supporters are standing around with flags and signs. A row of officers in riot gear now in front of the Capitol.
And it is a change from the violent clashes hours ago with rioters scaling walls, breaking and climbing through windows to get inside the Capitol. Lawmakers in lockdown for hours, some seen wearing gas masks inside the chambers and hiding under seats.
CBS 2's Dick Brennan here now with the very latest. What a day, Dick.
What a day, Maurice and Christine. You know, an attack on the Capitol is almost unthinkable, but it played out in front of America today. Order has been restored, but it almost seems like the soul of our democracy has been shaken. Protesters stormed the Capitol not long after Congress gathered to count the electoral votes of the presidential race. Inside, police were faced with hand-to-hand combat. The mob blew through doors as members of Congress dove to the floors of their chamber. It was barricaded with furniture, and authorities were seen with guns drawn to hold back the protesters.
I did hear what appeared to be a gunshot in distance, some kind of small thing. And there was just kind of general commotion. I think that, like, as soon as that door started getting knocked, everyone, the members, their staff, completed forward and
Tom Swazi was in the chamber.
There were shots fired when I was getting ready to leave the chamber, or up in the gallery, but I heard outside the chamber, not in the chamber.
One protester was shot, and she later died from her injuries. House members were urged to stay down. Some were heard praying. Others appeared dazed by what was unfolding.
It was pretty terrifying when the Senate suddenly went into recess and all of the doors in the chamber were locked down. The reporters were locked down in the chamber with the senators, and we really didn't know what was going on.
President Trump tweeted a video message to the protesters.
We had an election that was stolen from us, but you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. We love you. You're very special.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy also urged an end to the unrest.
This is not who we are. This is not who his supporters are. This is more than politics. This is the foundation of this nation. This is the democracy that we are supposed to be the torch for the rest of the world.
Earlier in the day, the president had urged supporters to march to the Capitol.
It is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing.
President-elect Joe Biden spoke out this afternoon.
At their best, the words of a president can inspire. At their worst, they can incite.
Now, the woman who was shot, as we said, later died. There were many injuries, and tonight, Governor Cuomo said he's sending 1,000 National Guard members to the D.C. area for 2 weeks to help ensure a peaceful transition of power. Marisa Christie.
All right, Dick, thank you.
Well, I'll just give you a short scenario of a couple of situations and what America is really about. This is the history from the past towards the present, and you see how there's no justice. You know, even after they tell the people, black people, in this one case I'm gonna speak on, that you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. You've been called lazy, but yet look what the black people did. They built the whole town. Then there was accusations that something allegedly a black boy touched a white girl, and the whole town took it out on black people. And there was never no apology. There was never no reparations. And they don't want to repay. And everything that you've seen in that video, in these videos, it is part of what American is. It's the underbelly that needs to be shown. So that was the reason why I made this video, because it doesn't go away. And as you see from the earlier centuries, racism transformed. It turned into violence, and it turned to riot. You need to understand where was the beginning and where we are at today. Do you think that we have resolved? And look at all the people, even though there's many people that suffered and endured some kind of hostility. We see that natives was the only one next to Africans that went through centuries, but it was how cut. And today, but the descendants of the slaves, it goes on in constitutional lockup and everything, medical, you name it. So this is the reason why African Americans, black people, are asking for reparations. and the government don't want to do it. And so they feel like they don't, after seeing all that video, no, we're not going to do anything. They had the same mindset. But here's the thing that's going to happen in the future. What comes around goes around, because I pray that if the United States ever come under what you've done to us as a people, the very people that you did this to and robbed and stole their land, what if there's a time where someone like Russia and China get together and some other few countries and say, we're just going to go ham on the United States. We're going to invade the United States, and we're going to come in and we're going to desecrate our armies, our navies, and this is going to, and your military guards, your police, your forces, and what you going to do? All your protection is going to be down. And we're going to be, it might have to go into tyranny. The civil war about to start right now between the states and Washington D.C. over immigrants. America causes things from the history, but she don't want to do the right thing. I have seen other countries that have similar incidents. They tried to reconcile in their own form. To let's say with different parts of Africans, they apologize, they return their stuff, and they said we want to make this right. America don't want to do a cheap way out, and don't want to do the right thing. She is very stubborn, and therefore her stubbornness is going to be the downfall. This may sound anti-American. I'm sorry that it does, but this is the truth. You can't keep doing evil to people and think that it's not going to come back at you. But when people say, just let it go, it's the past. And that's why I made this video. Why don't you just let it go? Just let the past be the past. Because you see how the past transcends in the present. And there are people saying, the very people that built the country, that fought alongside like any other citizen in the country, but denied simply because the color of the pigment in their skin and the texture of their hair. They were denied being a human being in the earth. And it's something that you have another human being that has the audacity to think that I'm your God, that it was meant for me to be over you. And they put this into centuries and centuries. This is the reason why America's is not going to get easier. And that's just because that's one of the many sins that America has never repented. And she won't make it right with the people that she's stolen. And the descendants of the people, of black people who have been enslaved and stolen property and things too. People just mocked them. And it's an insult when anybody, whether they're from here or anywhere part of the world, saying that you didn't work hard enough. Y'all lazy. But you see the history that black Americans was one of the Americans that built their own, and because of envy and jealousy, it was torn down. And every time black people try to do something, rebuild, they put politics and red tape in it and tear it down. I wouldn't doubt if they still do this to this day. And that's why. And it's like, how can you be loyal to any political party knowing that this has happened? Black people from this country been trying to be American, be a citizen, but be a citizen for 400 and still not considered. a darn citizen, and then to have people come over and tell you that your people are lazy, or we're not going to, and then you have people here say we're not going to recompense and do what's right. Well, guess what? There's a time you're going to pay. One day you're going to pay. And I pray that the people who have a stubborn heart, from the average citizen to the people in D.C., they're going to witness the day when what you've done in this planet, in this country, and you can't hide it. You can take it out of the books, but it's going to come to pass. One day we're going to be in a war, and I believe this. And what you've done, and the very people that you've done this to, which is part of my people, some of you going to be going in the exile. And there's nothing going to do because you didn't simply repent. I believe that. I believe it's going to happen. Because look at all the sins and look at all the one of many things that we've done in this country. We took God out of school. We put medical experiments on people. We unjustified. That's what's going on right all the way up to now. America is going to pay what she done to us, but what she done to other people in parts of the world. And there's other things that we don't even know parts of the world, but there's people that, and that's why I say it's, sometimes you do a good ass whooping, so to speak. And when somebody whoop our ass, they're gonna whoop it because they tired of it, and it was built off of it. Thievery, robbery, based on capitalism, and this is what we have. This is the reason why it ain't gonna be easy for us in the future, because look at what we've done to our own citizens, and we won't even do right. And just like in the days of Egypt, because God had the Hebrews, and I bet you if the Egyptians and other civilizations knew what they know, they probably said, I wish we would have never did what we did to these people. But what America did was beyond evil. What Egypt did to the ancient Israel. What you did was even beyond, because it's not only that you desecrate, you put them in bondage with the whip, you desecrate them and you torture them to death. And this place called America is going to find out, and the very people, and it might fall on the very descendants who put that on the very people that they done this in this country. It can happen, because it's easy to forgive, but it's hard to forget. And some people, it's going to be registered in the rest of their life. And all, from what I see, is black people just want what's done was right. But you see that envious, that hatred spirit, ladies and gentlemen, some people will die with it. I show how the way some people were in the Klan, and that they didn't have no mercy, and how they took James Byrd here. That was one incident. A group of men, and they just decapitated him. And it's more people that does evil stuff like that, and probably still doing evil stuff like that, snatching innocent lives off the earth in parts of this country. But they're going to pay one way or the other, because what you do is going to come back on you. It may come back on someone in your family. It might come back in some form or fashion, because what you do is what you put in the universe. It definitely comes back, and it comes back in it can come back in the economy. It can come back in all different types of ways. That's why we're not blessed, because we don't want to do the right thing. And reparations and repairment would be the right thing to do, but you won't do it because you say that's just the past. Meanwhile, you give on the other things, but after you torment and destroy, use your politics to destroy African Americans. Therefore, whatever comes down the pipe, and I pray that we survive it, we all make it, but the ones that they want to harden up the heart from the adversaries and to the politician to the famous. They're gonna see. They're gonna see, and they can't run when it comes from the judgment of the Most High God. So, as I got said for this video, but yeah, America have always been violent. It will always be violent because there's a spirit on it, and she will never repent. She don't want to repent. Therefore, she's going to pay one way or the other. And I pray that those of us will get our life right in our personal spiritual life with Christ, because she's going to pay. Look at what she's done to a group of people, and never don't want to be remorseful or repentant. Therefore, it's the cost is going to come. All right, then, ladies and gentlemen, this has been an enlightening video. Give you another part of what American history they're trying to leave out, but it will still come to pass. From the past to the present to the future. May it be a better tomorrow than it is today. Take care. Be blessed.